Awesome. So today we're really going to focus on breaking down the two articles you read that offered two very different issues. So relating to gender, really to kind of figure out the different nuances that go into this conversation. And then we're going to talk about the issues you guys have chosen and are addressing in terms of what you are in the process of researching for your final paper. And then we'll go over the perspective instructions and conducting the research, especially in terms of what databases we can look at, what are different strategies that can really help you guys to narrow down the different sources that you guys are going to be using for that prospectus in general. So before we get started with this, were there any questions over the break in terms of where we left off the week before, or any questions in terms of the paper 4 prompt? Any concerns? Thumbs up if you guys are good. Or you can unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can just type it in the chat if that works as well. So I have a few thumbs up. Okay. Awesome. So to begin with, and getting into our discussion of the articles, we're going to start by splitting up into small groups. Since we did focus on 2 articles, we have millennials see paternity leave as a priority, and the more gender equality, the fewer women in STEM. So to begin our conversation about this, before we get into the paper 4 prospectus and how we can conduct research, we're going to break into groups of 3 or 4 and take about 20 to 30 minutes before we have our larger class discussion. So in the groups, you guys want to consider both articles. So identify the main issues that both articles address and how they relate overall to the conversation related to gender and gender roles. And then I want you guys to choose a quote from both articles that stand out to you and analyze them, so that when we return to our large class session, we can talk about your observations, the assessments in terms of what you decoded in terms of the quotes, and what kind of stood out to you guys in terms of how your group broke down those articles. So any questions about our group work before we go into the breakout sessions? Okay, so thumbs up, awesome. So let me stop our screen share and let me recording, and then we're gonna get started. So beginning with the first article, so Alsop's millennials see paternity leave as a priority. So what did you guys address? What did you guys present about it? Especially in terms of what stood out to you guys about the article, what quotes did you guys choose, and then of course how it's adding to that overall conversation. Oh, there's my timer. Surrounding gender roles. There we go.
Is this open to the floor or just specific groups?
Is there a specific group that wants to go first, or we can just open it to the floor?
Group 1 guys, you want to go now?
That's fine, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that sounds good.
This one, for gender role, this one goes into detail about how typically you would think that males would assume the gender role where they would stay at work and they wouldn't take care of their kids, but this focuses on paternity leave for young males now who want to be with their children during their developmental stage.
Yeah, so definitely
it focuses on, it talks about how companies might be less approving of wanting to provide paternity leave just due to not having workers and such. So we saw that in the lower portion of the paragraph, such as men can be fired, demoted, or turned down for promotions or get terrible assignments if they take leave. But also it goes the other way around, where some companies are offering more paternity leave to take in more members for employees.
Yeah, because of course, if it's a benefit, then that's going to attract more employees, and they're going to be more kind of devoted for that company. So that's definitely a really good observation from this, especially if we think about IBM as that example. Sorry, Jane.
With the family dynamic, it was also talking about how it helps the father be able to connect with like the child more, but then it also explained how it can help out the mom because the mom was able to focus more on her career and the family rather than like she had some help. It wasn't just her, so she can focus on herself and her family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we think of it, it's good all around for that family, especially in terms of, if we think about today, a lot of families are dual income, so both parents work. So how it's really important for that kind of that balance within that relationship, definitely, and of course, building that relationship. What else did you guys identify? Any other observations? Or what quote really stood out to you guys? I think you talked about it.
I found it interesting that the European countries, even though the European countries differed amongst themselves, they had quite a bit of more maternity leave, which I guess is to be expected since they tend to be more, their government, they tend to have more social programs.
Yeah. I'm trying to find that paragraph. But that's definitely really important. Here it is. Because if we think of when we're talking about gender and a lot of issues relating to gender, it's not, the issues aren't universal necessarily. So that's really important to note in terms of how, when we think about different countries have different issues or even approach gender differently in terms of the expectations, the roles, and of course the benefits that are given when we think about even jobs, how things are normalized in different countries that aren't necessarily normalized here. That is definitely really important, especially as we're thinking about making an argument about gender. When we're thinking about our audience, we really need to think about, well, who are we having a national audience in terms of just in this country, or are we focusing on an international audience? Because how we would appeal to them based on what would be commonplace for them would really change. So you'd really have to kind of pinpoint what we're approaching or how we're approaching it based on that audience. Similarly, if you want to argue for something that is centered on even a different country from the United States, that's also something to consider in terms of what are the commonplaces there, what are kind of the normalized actions or allowances, or even if we think of here paternity leave, what are like the benefits in different countries. Awesome. So what about group 2? What would you guys add in terms of what stood out to you guys about Alsop's article about paternity leave? Any other observations? In group 2, that's Ava, Mia, and then Riley. What quote did you guys identify? Can you guys hear me okay?
I'm sorry, what group is it?
It was group 2, which I think you might have been in there as well. I don't know why it's not showing you in it. Because you were with them, right, Gustavo?
I remember at least one of my group members was Riley.
Yeah, I don't know why when I'm looking at the breakout room like list, you're not listed under there for some reason. But what were you guys chatting about? Because I know you guys were using the chat mostly. So see, Riley identified like the first paragraph.
Yeah, so for the
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. It's always online. So Riley mentioned the quote, it's like an arms race to provide the best parental leave benefits for fathers as well as mothers, with how men are more wanting parental leave, not first paragraph, first article, sorry. So definitely that's something that is touched on in terms of, because if we think about workers now, right, older generations are starting to retire, so it's get more of the push towards millennials. So of course, how jobs are conforming and giving more parental leave benefits just to attract employees. So if we think about that, this is definitely a really good push. So if we think about getting towards that equality in terms of fair parental leave between spouses. But anything else your group wants to add or kind of touch on?
For the second article, we talked about
We're getting to the
how the
article.
percentage of.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. No.
No, it's okay. Sorry for the confusion. Just because of with the note taking, I can't switch between them because I'd have to delete it. So we'll get to the second article in just a few moments. So hold that thought. Sorry, Gustavo. What about group 3? So it's Giselle, James, and Kenya. So any other observations you can add?
Well, we said the same thing as group 1, how it has benefits like the fathers bonding with the babies and how it helps out the mothers, but also how it should be culturally acceptable and viewed as something normal instead of like the fathers being fired if they take on maternity leave or being turned down from promotions.
So that is definitely a big point that LSAT makes, is part of even sometimes when they are offered these benefits, sometimes fathers or even mothers don't choose to take it. So how, if we think of LSAT noting that we need to change our culture to normalize parental leave so that there isn't really a fear of repercussions, there isn't that concern, because of course, one thing that's really notable is like, even if your job gives you that benefit, oftentimes we see people not taking advantage of it just because they are scared of kind of repercussions or the optics of it. For instance, if we think of vacation time, right? There's some people, like I know, that have vacation time, but then they don't use it just because they don't want to have that kind of look poorly on them when they're thinking about their yearly, trying to think of what it's called, but if they're giving a like bonus, so if they took that vacation time, there's fear over that. However, if we think of other cultures like Europe or even Australia, using that vacation time is very normal. So of course, other cultures travel a lot more because they take that time off. So when you think about gender, kind of, we can have arguments that are noting how the culture in terms of how we view these different issues needs to change in order for the equality to really take root. Anything else you guys would add for your observations? Okay, what about group 4? So we have Anela, Ole, and Vivian. Any other observations? What did you guys discuss, or what quote did you guys identify?
We talked about the quote on page, I think it's 4, and it said the company increased paternity leave to 16 weeks in July of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first 6 months, 19% of fathers took 6 or more weeks. So we were talking about how that seemed like a fairly low percentage, but in the sentence after that quote, it notes how it went up, and then it was nearly 40%. So, I mean, assuming that this increase is constant, and the article was written in 2017, I believe, I'm assuming it has increased since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were talking about if that trend is associated with normalizing paternity leave. And then we also talked about the same thing as building these connections between fathers and their children and how it's detrimental to like long-term relations, because both parents have an equal role in that early developmental stage.
Yeah. So this is definitely really good observations. So it'd be really interesting to look at this data because we can even forecast. So we can even, as Anela is mentioning really well, right? If we think one way that we can even interpret this data is, right, in that first 6 months versus last December, right, more people took it because they saw others take it and it was okay. So sometimes that is what needs to be done in terms of how it becomes normalized, is seeing other people take advantage of that benefit or other people taking paternity leave. And then of course, how that kind of shows that it's okay for men to do that. One thing that's also interesting here that it's kind of not noting is how it increased the paternity leave to 16 weeks. However, it's focusing on 6 weeks or more. So it would be really interesting to see how many of the fathers take out the max amount of paternity leave, so 16 weeks versus just 6 weeks, because that's a very big difference, especially if we think about child development. So if we had a breakdown of this, that would maybe show even more in terms of change. Because we're trying to think, what is the percentage of 6 out of 16? That is fairly low. It's like just a little over a third, I think. Awesome. And then for the sake of time, so our 5th group, so Alan, America, Artie, any other observations or what quote did you guys focus on?
Just like the other groups, like group 1 and 3, I think it was, we were also talking about how like the paternity leave when it has to do with dads. The quote that we were looking at was the one where it says, I think it's the last page, and it says, often it takes a corporate culture change to make men more comfortable about paternity leave. Yeah, that rest of the quote.
And giving into, been very explicit about the need to remove any stigma associated with paternity leave. We asked some of our influential, high-performing men to share their stories about paternity leave and continuing to be successful at work, if not more successful. Yeah, so that's definitely really important, especially building into that quote that the previous group noted, especially in terms of how when we think of a culture shift, right, it's removing that stigma, and some corporations are already starting to do that. So kind of how can we even increase that culture shift even nationally, right? So it's not just within one company, but it's something that's normalized like across the board. So of course, it's noting one way here in terms of having influential examples. So these would be like cases in point to show that paternity leave does not take away from success. If anything, it makes the work and home life more successful, is what we could argue. Awesome. Any other observations about this article or anything else stand out to you guys as a whole? If we think about this article, how persuasive did you guys find it? Especially when we think of how it's appealing to an audience and showing those benefits. What would you guys say the primary appeal is? Is it to pathos, to logos, to ethos? What do you guys think? What would that primary appeal to be? So Artie says logos. So we can definitely see that there is definitely a primary appeal to logos here. And I would say the secondary appeal would be to pathos, especially as Riley's noted in the beginning, showing how the father wants to be with his growing child. So in terms of those being really important here. So if we think about like the difference between how Alsop is appealing to pathos versus logos, a lot of the claims are presented as statements of facts, and of course it's presenting data to make it logical in terms of why it benefits or why this is a good thing, but it's presenting that emotional need to show kind of why it's important on a interpersonal level, right, for people. So of course, if we think about that very beginning, getting people who maybe aren't as accepting of paternity leave to empathize with the position of these fathers and say, like, it is unfair that you're not able to form that same bond, right, with your growing child and see those formative months. Because of course, any of you guys have experience with babies, right? Young infants change so quickly in terms of their development. So that is really important. So definitely, it makes a huge difference, yeah. So of course, that is getting that empathy in the very beginning to show kind of why it's important before showing, okay, it's important for them, but this is why it matters for even us as a society with the logic of that situation. Especially if we think about economics with companies, how when they're increasing this because of that importance for men, it also increases job performance because of course they want jobs at those companies. Dan sharing his personal experience. So daughter likes your wife better than you. I'm sorry to hear that. It's really interesting because I know like thinking of my own family experiences, I don't think any of my uncles ever took paternity leave. So I think most of my cousins are closer to their mothers when I think about them. So it is really interesting how that bonding is something because of basically the culture surrounding leave in the very beginning of a child's life. And we can even show that in terms of if we think of, I don't remember the term, but there's a specific condition. I know it's like the colloquialism is like Russian baby syndrome or orphanage syndrome, something like that. But studies have shown like when children do not have that bonding period with a mother, father, or any type of person at the very formative early days, weeks, and months of their lives, that makes it harder for them to form connections with other people. So of course that even further proves like why it's so important. So turning towards our...
I think it's called reactive adaptation syndrome or something like that.
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry. It was, you said...
So I think it's called like reactive attachment disorder.
That sounds really...
I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. So even making
like
that...
basically they just get left in a room, like in a crib, and no one's around. So they're just there.
Yeah, it's very sad. So of course, if we think of kind of that as like the extreme to show even why it's so important for that bonding. Yeah. It's moving to our second article. So Kazan's, the more gender equality, the fewer women in STEM. So is there a specific group that wants to go first, or we can have general observations and then we can get into the quotes you guys identified after? Like, what did you guys think of Kazan's article?
I thought it was kind of surprising because I thought that like STEM wouldn't be lowering in gender equal countries. I thought it would be going up.
Yeah, it is really surprising, which is one of the reasons I chose this article, because of course, if we think about like even today within education, there's a push towards STEM in basically even high schools, because I know high schools nowadays like even have STEM like academies. Did you guys have those when you were in school? in high school?
I grew up in STEM schools, so my elementary school was a STEM school, my middle school was, my high school wasn't, but I mean, I do hate math and science, so I guess it didn't do much.
Yeah, so it's kind of contradictory to this like giant push towards STEM that is occurring within our society to think, of course, even though that's happening here in the US, right, there are still fewer women who are going into that profession. So that really kind of brings up a number of questions, especially when we think about gender equality within careers, as to why. Any other observations or thoughts about it?
Yeah, well, like when they talk about the how, like basically, you know, with the equality, you have more choices,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So and you know, there's always the talk about how women are more like natural caregivers, you know. So that's why you see a lot of them as nurses, teachers, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have the choice. And like Jaden said, like, you know, math is boring to her. You know what I mean? Not a lot of people find math fascinating. You know, science it can be different. You know what I mean? But I feel like most people don't look at math and science jobs having a high pay field.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think, especially with math, like a lot of people are like, oh, if you like math, you're probably just going to be a math teacher. You know, you don't really see, you know what I mean? Like engineering requires a lot of math, you know, and that's part of the STEM. But, you know what I mean? There's no one really there like talking about that. They're just like, oh, check out the STEM program. It's math and science. People are like, yeah, no thanks. Like, I'd rather do something more valuable with my time.
Personality plays a part in that, definitely, in terms of nature or how nurturing somebody is. And of course, if you think of like math versus engineering, right? One thing to note, especially that this article doesn't really know, is in terms of like with more choices, it's also kind of the idea of, well, if there aren't many that like already in that career to act as mentors or even teachers, sometimes that can have a subconscious effect on people in terms of going into a specific career or even motivating people to go into that career. So it is a really complex thing when we think about gender, because it's not like a simple answer in terms of why there are fewer women in STEM here in the United States. And then James brings up an interesting point. So for immigrants, it's not that surprising. So if we think about this, like one thing that this notes in terms of how when we think about culture, culture definitely affects, I'm trying to think of how to word it, but affects how people view careers. So where you came from, where your family came from, that really changes kind of how you view something moving forward. Because for instance, right, my family, my dad's a Filipino immigrant, so there's this giant push towards STEM, giant push towards making money. So I'm a very big disappointment as a teacher. Because of course, where they grew up, they didn't have money. So the values change depending on the culture that you come from, depending on your family situation, what is important and what you kind of value in making that decision. Because of course, if we think about lower paying jobs, like if you come from a secure family, right, it's maybe not as forward in your mind. Does that make sense? Or any other thoughts about
Something
that?
I just thought about too was, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was saying something I just thought about too was like, you know, you hear about these like women scientists from like the early 1900s, you know, late 1800s, like, and I think part of that was, you know, because they were told they couldn't, you know, so they kind of set out to like prove we can. And I feel like that's kind of the same thing, you know, in these other countries, you know, like how it brings up they don't have that equality. So it's kind of like, okay, where now it's like, you know, here they're like, oh, we can't be scientists. They're like, no, you can do math and science. And then girls were just kind of like, oh, well, you know what I mean? It's kind of that same thing. Like before you're 21, you're like, yeah, I'm going to get drunk tonight. Like, and then you turn 21, your friends are like, you want to go out and get a drink? You're like, that's quite, it's not really fun anymore.
Time in like an hour.
You know, now that I can, like, you know, kind of loses its appeal, like almost.
So like as the culture of STEM has changed, then of course that drive could change. So that's definitely something that's really important to note. And of course, one thing to note, even for this article, in terms of it's looking at this as a whole, but there are so many different careers in STEM. So it would be interesting to see, like, is this kind of across the board, or do different STEM careers have different percentages? Or representation in terms of a representation of women? Because looking at this as a whole, right, it's really hard to say. Any other observations, or we can start getting into the quotes. So what quotes did you guys identify? So James brings up the good point. So developed countries offer more opportunities. So definitely in terms of more equality, more opportunities, more choices. So those choices may be different. But what quotes stood out to you guys? Looking at this article. What about, because I know, who has a quote you want to focus on? Should we go in reverse order? We should go from 1 to 5 again. Can jump around.
I could go.
Awesome.
So for our group, we talked about how not the gender equality discourage girls from pursuing science, is that it allows them not to if they're not interested. It was on page 3. So we were saying like how, like just going back, like how some countries, they're mostly like gender equality. So most girls, like even though they do pursue, like they have a higher chance of getting to science, the most likely to lean toward like liberal arts, just because everywhere's like gender equality, like they don't feel pressure to make as much money as they should, comparing to like other countries who are who doesn't have gender equality. Obviously girls there would want to make more money because they have to.
Yeah.
So that's what we taught.
So that's definitely really important, especially when we think about, where did it go? I want to say, like even getting into this part right here, how countries with the highest gender equality tend to be welfare states. They write, with high levels of social security, the less gender countries tend to have less social support for people. So it's like the only option if a woman wants to be independent, especially in terms of separate from a husband or their family. Especially if we think of they offer a more certain financial future than, say, painting or writing versus here in the United States. So it's definitely important to note. What else? What other quotes did you guys identify? So that was Vivian's. I know, Gustavo, you were wanting to say something earlier about this article. Like what stood out for you? Or what quote did you kind of focus on with your group?
About how like the percentage and like how women, where they have less inequalities, have like a mindset where they have to find a job that's like guaranteed a financial financial stability, compared to other places where women have like the freedom to like kind of go for any other job that they'd like, and they tend to lead more away from STEM and like science and math.
Yeah. So kind of touching on that same point. Awesome. Anyone else? Any other observations or any quotes you guys want to identify? So we have Artie identifying the quote. So some would say that the gender STEM gap occurs not because girls can't do science, but because they have other alternatives based on their strengths in verbal skills. In wealthy nations, they believe that they have the freedom to pursue those alternatives and not worry so much that they pay less. So definitely in terms of this point. So really this, very similar to the last one, is focusing on the intersectionality in terms of culture. Culture and basically the country changes the perspective surrounding that issue. So very similar to Alsop's when we're thinking about presenting an argument about gender, right? We really need to think about how the culture of the audience you're focusing on, or the culture of, if we want to narrow down that argument, really changes kind of what issues we can have, the perspectives of the issues in terms of even the claims that we would want to make and how we would want to appeal to an audience. Which is primarily why I chose those two articles, especially in terms of adding to this conversation surrounding gender. And thinking about Kazan's article, before I move forward into talking about research, what would you say her primary appeal is? Is it pathos, logos, or ethos? And of course, even why does she choose that? So definitely we have logos. There are a lot of statistics here. Even if we think of the very beginning, the very first line of this article starts with statistics. So it's very heavy-handed, I would say even more so than Alsop's article. So that is really rooted here in terms of how she's appealing to her audience. Because of course, if we think of her claims, right, if we think about how she's addressing the fewer women in STEM, right, she is not using a lot of emotion in terms of valuing it as good or bad thing. She's just being very frank in terms of this being something that's going on. So if we think about it, why would she have less emotional appeals for this argument? Because as we talked about with Alsop's, he did have appeals to pathos. He started with an appeal to pathos. So why would Kazan kind of step away from that more? Any ideas, any thoughts? To be objective, yeah. And that's what we can even get to in terms of one thing to note here is these two articles are written very differently. Alsop is a male writer, while Kazan is a female writer. So if we think about like how we're approaching this, we can even see kind of when they're addressing things, right? Because she's focusing on women in STEM as a woman, if she had appealed with more emotion, then that could make her argument too subjective, and then people could maybe criticize it more. So sometimes, unfortunately, we think about the genderization of language. When a writer is making an argument, sometimes they have to think about their emotional appeals based on their gender, which is something that's really interesting. Any other thoughts or any other observations before I move forward? Okay, so moving forward, we're going to be talking about the research that we're doing. So in terms of, we've had some time now for you guys to figure out the issue that you want to research and address surrounding gender. So today we're going to talk about kind of the different research strategies. And to begin with, it's really important to know and see kind of where everyone is in terms of what issues you guys have chosen to address. So what issues have you guys chosen? If we can share them, we can go, you can write them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share it. So like, what issues are you guys interested in addressing? Whether it's different from the articles that we've read, or whether it's kind of in line with those, which ones are you focusing on? Or what are you leaning towards in terms of the argument that you want to make? Yeah, so the wage gap is really important. So that can be something that you can talk about. And of course, if we think about wage gap, something with keeping Kazan and Alsop's in mind, it'd be interesting, depending on like the argument you're making, it can differ depending on country. How big that wage gap is or how small it is. So that's something that you can address here. Even if we think about wage gap, even if we're thinking about that connection to Alsop, even, in terms of Kazan, in terms of wage gap, depending on career. So it's something you can keep in mind in terms of the gender wage gap. What else? What other issues are you guys addressing or interested in? So equal education access for females. So that's definitely something that you can, if we think of similarly thinking education versus in career, different access, right? So you can really narrow down or widen that argument depending on if you want to focus on a specific country, if you want to focus on this internationally, or even make an argument about another country. That would be really interesting. So country, even if we think about educational access, like even educational level, if we think about, is there equal educational access when we think about an associate's versus a bachelor's versus a master's degree or a doctorate? That's something that can be addressed. What other issues are you guys focusing on? Because I want to say from the discussion post that you guys did before the break, the issue of like beauty standards, I think was addressed. So especially if we think of beauty standards in terms of for men versus women, or even if we think about how that can, the intersectionality of race with beauty standards. Yeah, so Kenya, inequality of pay in athletics, definitely. There is a lot that's been written about that recently, especially when we think of centered on like the women's soccer team, like US soccer team. Cannot type today. Because of course they've been very vocal about that, especially if you think of like Megan Rapinoe focusing on it. Yeah, so definitely free birth control for women. Especially if we think about reproductive rights. Because that even is something that's addressed here, but even internationally, that's something that you could even focus on. Yeah, so gender stereotypes pushed onto children at earlier age, definitely. Because we see that in our media all the time, especially if you think about even, I watched the Disney movies so often as a child, and there's so many gender stereotypes in those Disney movies up until the last decade, which of course, long after I was a child. So there's a lot you can look at there. There's a lot that's been written. Anything else that you guys have been focusing on or interested in? So you can start to break this down. Yeah, the effect of gender stereotyping. And of course, when you think about that, that is something that you can even see gender stereotyping in terms of like the emotional effect, but also like the physical or the psychological effects of the gender stereotypings, especially if we think about emotional, right? How it affects like confidence, personality, or even physical if we think about the issue with gender stereotyping in terms of around body type, right? How that has led, especially recently, into like a rise in eating disorders. Personality traits, so like in terms of like personality stereotypes, or even like the issue of like masculinity versus femininity in terms of personality. What else are you guys focusing on? Anyone else? There are a lot of issues, and these, it's not even a complete list. And of course, you guys have the option just to focus on whichever one interests you the most. So if you do need help still, as kind of we've read through these articles, that discussion post that you did, and you're still not sure how you want to narrow it down, that's something we can talk about later in class today as we get further into this. But we do, if you haven't already, you do want to kind of narrow it down so that we can begin the research process, because our next big assignment that's due, which is due a week from today, so Monday, December 7th, is our paper 4 prospectus, which includes an annotated bibliography. So for this prospectus, it is, as I've kind of mentioned the week before last, it's really a breakdown of your thought process as we begin to build and narrow down the argument that you're going to be making for your 4th paper. Because of course, based on that prompt, you're not just focusing on that issue, but you're choosing a stance, you're choosing an audience, and then you're working on persuading that audience through claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies in order to agree with the stance that you're presenting. So for the prospectus, right? Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me still? It booted me out of my own Zoom. It's so rude. Okay, let me open the chat again. Did you guys all get booted and hit restart, or was it just me?
Just you.
Okay, so it just hates me. Great. So, oh, still recording. Awesome. So sorry about that. Gotta love the internet. So as I was saying, narrowing down that focus. So as we get into that research, like once you've chosen the topic about gender you want to research, it's figuring out the stance you want to take. So that's in part 1. And then the reasoning for taking that stance. So in terms of why do you want to make that argument, specifically in terms of like the relevance of it for even you, or relevance for society, or even if it just interests you. You have some freedom in terms of that. And then of course, part 2 is identifying those inquiry questions, which we talked about the week before last. So in terms of inquiry questions, the different questions that we need to find the answers for in terms of knowing as much as we can about the specific topic you've chosen. And of course, getting all of the different perspectives that you need in terms of figuring out who your audience is, as well as kind of who your opposition is and what they believe, as well as kind of what's going on about that topic. And then the most important part for part 2 is narrowing down your specific audience. So considering the different topics you've chosen that you guys have shared with the class today, right, that's really going to change how you're going to, based on who your audience is going to really change, right, how you're going to be addressing that argument. So how you're going to be wording those claims, and how we're going to be using specific rhetorical strategies to appeal to them. So we want to narrow that down. So figuring out kind of how narrow, how specific you want it to be, and then, or how broad, and then getting into that background, the demographic information that can really help you to figure out what would be the best way to persuade this person or this group of people, especially if we think about kind of where they come from, their biases, and of course, figuring out those specific appeals you want to have and strategies you want to use. Part 3 is where we have your annotated bibliography portion, which, have you guys ever written an annotated bibliography before? Is that something familiar to you guys, or is that something like you maybe have heard of but never done? So we have a few yeses. So in terms of this, for your prospectus, like for our annotated bibliography, it's going to have 4 sources. So that you can really understand the different perspectives, you want to have at least 2 sources that present your opposition to help you identify your audience or identify the reasoning and claims that you can present to counter their points. And then we have 2 sources that are going to support your points or brainstorm your own claims. So we want to kind of really figure out how we can find those 4 sources. And of course, you can have more than 4 if you would like. One thing to note in terms of as we are building towards drafting our rough draft, the sources used in your rough draft can be kind of in addition to that prospectus. So after we have the prospectus due, like you can still have time to find more sources if you need to. And then of course we will talk more about the annotated bibliography on Wednesday, and we will look at some examples of the prospectus as well. But essentially, like as we're building towards this, for those who aren't familiar, an annotated bibliography always starts with the citation, so an MLA works cited page citation, and then we have paragraphs that are summarizing the points, and a paragraph explaining how it helps you and how you plan on using that article in preparing for your paper. But any questions about this assignment as we work towards it? Since it's going to be due a week from today. Thumbs up if you guys are good. We can move towards research. Awesome. So if there are any questions about this, just feel free to let me know later, or we can even address them after class if any comes up. But moving towards research, right? There are a lot of steps that go into that research process as we prepare for the prospectus and for the final paper. So of course, when we think of strategies, we really need to think of kind of where we are in that process, and of course, where we can be looking. We can look specifically for our individual sources. So the first step is something that we've already started. So choosing a topic to research, which a lot of you guys have already, and then developing inquiry questions, which we started to do. As we get into kind of now finding our sources, the next step that we want to do is really brainstorming key search terms. Because of course, when we're thinking of research, we don't want to narrow our search terms just to one. We want to have a lot of variety so that we can get like a fuller sense, especially because when we're thinking about different issues, right, there may be synonyms in terms of how different writers address that different issue, or even if we think if we're needing to do research for the opposition, right, word choices that would connect it to that opposition. So if we think of an example, right, what example would we want to do for our little class today in terms of an issue? Any volunteers for an example? What do you guys think? So one that would be easy if we do kind of focusing on, I need to change the color of that, how gender roles, angry. We could focus even on how gender roles are taught to kids as that overarching issue. So when we're thinking about brainstorming terms, right, we know that we're going to have a lot of synonyms. So we can focus on gender roles versus gender stereotyping. We think about like gender representation in media, right? Really, the key word should be gender to kind of all root that together. And when we think about the effect, we can think of the synonyms like kids, children, child, etc. But what other key terms can we add to that? Especially if we want to think of how kids are taught. Because one thing that we talked about last week, if we think of this, so James mentioned is definitely values. So you could do gender values to emphasize how that's taught, right? That would definitely be a really good one that we could focus on, or even gender norms. If we think about this, we could talk about gender and toys that connect to how kids are taught gender, or even like gender in Disney, or even more broadly, like kids shows or movies to really show kind of how they're presented in those. What other search terms can we have? Any other ideas? Okay, so we can see like with this, gender chores, we could even get into like family dynamics and gender, right? To really show kind of how we learn about gender can be tied to our family and how our family operates, how they interact with one another. So the biggest thing with key terms is we want to have as many options as possible, because when we're thinking about our research process, right, if we just limit it to one, we're limiting the different sources that are going to come up in that source in our search. So by having more options, it gives us more variety in terms of the different articles that may come up that could potentially help us, especially in terms of building and creating an argument in which sometimes within that research process, there isn't a source that presents exactly what you wanted to say. So we're just looking for something that's related that can inform our decision-making process and inform the argument that we're making. So the broader, the better in terms of our search terms. And then once we're doing this, we want to adjust having these different terms, right? We want to look for the ones that address different stances, different issues. So we can think about how we can change our search terms to emphasize the differences. For instance, if we think about gender representation, I can change it to gender misrepresentation in media. That may give me different sources, right? So figuring out like, are there certain search terms that may help us? And even if we think about for different stances, we can focus on like different keywords that may help in terms of good versus bad, wrong, right? Adding kind of a value or a bias to help us find like the different stances. Especially if you think of like, what is good representation? Because that's such a relative term. Excuse me, sorry, my allergies have been driving me crazy. So now we have our search terms, right? We're looking for our sources. Now we want to use our databases. So in terms of a research project, I always recommend using the college's databases, because that is going to be the easiest way for you guys to find those sources and of course, find your citations. So in your previous English 100 class, did you guys have a tutorial with the librarian? Are you guys familiar with our school databases or how to access them? So a lot of you saying yes, and then one, it's been a bit. So looking at our databases, I just wanted to go over that really briefly and then give you some recommendations of mine in terms of the databases that may help you as you feel like begin this research process, especially because when we're thinking about our research databases, right, there isn't necessarily one that you should use. There are a lot of options, and it's really important to try different databases because, of course, depending on the database, that really can change the sources that come up. Are you guys familiar with like how the databases function in terms of why they present different sources? So essentially, Palomar College, our librarians especially, they have a budget for these databases. Because if we're thinking about articles, it can get really expensive if you're trying to use and find an article, especially a scholarly journal or even ones printed in a newspaper that needs a subscription. So Palomar College kind of consolidates them and pays for certain databases for us to use to make it easier for us to find it in one place, because some articles can range from like even $1 up to kind of hundreds of dollars depending on the source. So it's really important to kind of use the database so it's free. So in terms of our school webpage, right, all of them can be found when we go to databases for the Palomar Library Home. And there are a few that I recommend using that can really help you find the different sources you're looking for. So the first one is that first one on the list, the Academic Search Complete. So this is a multidisciplinary database. So that means that it has multiple journals, scholarly peer-reviewed, that you can focus on so that you can have a lot of variety. So it has some of them, like basically the most sources that can come up. One thing to note for Academic Search Complete though, is it's not geared towards one specific topic. So depending on your search terms, sometimes you'll get a lot of different things. Which that one looks like this. So in terms of Academic Search Complete, it's by EBSCOhost. And of course, you can narrow it down as much as you want to. So I always recommend choosing full text. You can choose scholarly peer-reviewed journals if you'd like. One thing to note is I do not have a requirement for you guys, but if you do want to look for data, if that's something that really interests you for the argument that you're making, then you may want to use the peer-reviewed journals. And then of course with this, it's just a basic search. You can narrow it down in terms of the publication date, because of course, depending on the argument that you're making, you may want your publication to be as recent as possible, especially if we think about gender and how much issues related to gender have changed over the last decade to the last like several decades. So having a narrowed down publication date can really help you to figure out and find the ones that are most relevant, because of course, as they list, it does it based on basically relevance in terms of your search terms. So if we kind of were to look at this, and we were to just Google or search within this gender roles. Oh, I hate when I have to log in. It's angry. Okay, we're gonna just go to the beginning. Sorry, my internet's being a little finicky today. There we go. So if we were to look at just gender roles, it will have different recommendations for you. So sometimes that can really help you to figure out your search terms, but it always goes by relevance. So if you want to switch it to the newest, the most recent, then that's something that you can focus on. And then even you can change the dates here. So if I just want to do basically maybe 2010 to 2020, then I can do so, and it'll kind of re-upload that for me. And you can see the different terms that come up. Publications, there are a lot of options. You do want to make sure it has a PDF version or an HTML full text, because otherwise, if you have to, if it doesn't have it available immediately, then it may take some time for the library to request it. So it's just easier to have the full text just listed here already for you to access it. And of course, when you're opening it, so say this one is really recent, so this is June 2020. One thing to note, if you do find an article that really interests you, it will have subject terms listed with it. So that's something that you can actually click on to find more articles that are similar to it or address similar aspects. So that can be really beneficial. And then of course the abstract and then the article. Once you do find an article, the most important thing is you always want to save it, or at least if you're using it, you can email it to yourself, which is really quick, so that you have that record, and you can even choose to email the citation with it. It's being real slow. There we go. So you can just put whatever your email is, and then you can choose what type of citation you want. So that way you have it, and you can choose MLA citation. So that way you don't have to find that MLA citation. You don't have to create it yourself. So that's the academic search complete. Another one that I really recommend in terms of breaking this down is, where did it go? We have Gale Gender Watch. So Gender Watch is articles, a database specifically focused on gender. So that one is more narrowed. So of course it's not going to be searching through as many articles and databases. So that might make it easier for you guys to narrow it down. And it's very similar in terms of you choose the full text. You can choose if it's peer reviewed, or you can go to advanced search and give more options. In terms of if you want a podcast magazine, so what type of source, and even the dates. So if you want it the last 3 years or whatever it may be. So it's very similar. So Gender Watch is more specific in terms of this. And then where did it go? If you want newspaper articles, because one thing to know is whether it's the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, like Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, right? They are subscriptions online. So sometimes if you're going directly through that website, it'll only let you view so many articles before it wants you to pay. So Palomar does pay for the database for the magazines and the newspapers. So they have the Los Angeles Times, they have Newswire, they have the New York Times. So if that's something you want to look at, then I do recommend going through Palomar's databases for newspaper articles. In terms of another database, I recommend we have Opposing Viewpoints in Context. So this one is really good because it really gives you, when you're searching, multiple types of articles so you can see the different viewpoints about that specific search term. So if we give this a second to load, sorry, internet's being very slow right now. Right, it has immediate issues of interest, but you can just type in gender pay gap. And it'll give you different options. So it will give you academic journals, and it'll give you different viewpoints in terms of giving different perspectives about the topic, and even audio files or news. So it really breaks down the different types. And very similarly, you can choose if you want like the full text peer reviewed right here, or even if you want to filter by publication date or what types of publications, you can do so as well. So for instance, I know one of you guys wanted to do within athletics. So this first article, an easy fix for soccer is gender pay gap. Or even gender pay gap is mostly a myth. So it just offers multiple perspectives about it. So it has the article commentary here. And then of course, if you do find an article, it always will have some on the right-hand side that gives you similar articles. So that can be really helpful in finding other articles that are related to it, or even other search terms that you can access for this. And of course, it has that citation at the bottom that you can use. So it makes it really convenient in terms of accessing and using that source. So any questions about the databases or using them? Since it's just kind of a brief overview, since most of you guys did do a library visit before. Okay, save one, no, okay. Awesome. So once you find the articles, right, as we've talked about before, the first thing you want to do is read that abstract to narrow that down before you read the whole article, and then we can start putting this together. So that is what we're focusing on for the next week, is working on that prospectus, choosing the stance, choosing your audience, and brainstorming the different ways that you want to appeal to them. And then of course, getting that research in terms of those who are basically sources that are in opposition to the stance you want to take versus sources you can use as evidence. So in terms of this, that is our only assignment that we're working towards. On Wednesday, we will talk more about the prospectus, like going through examples, and we'll have time to kind of evaluate the different examples that you're looking at. I did want to have the remainder of class for any questions that you may have, or if you need help narrowing down your stance or even the issue that you're researching. And of course, having time if you want more individual help with the research portion. So if there are no questions, let me just make sure I have roll updated, and we will end a little early for those of you who don't want to stay for any individual help. I think I'm good. So if not, we will end a little early. So I hope you had a good break for those who I didn't wish that earlier. And if you have any questions, just feel free to email me or stay in the Zoom so we can address them or give you specific research help. Other than that, we will end early, so have a good one. I will see you guys on Wednesday. I hope you guys have a good week back at school or Zoom school as we enter this final countdown.
Thank you. See you Wednesday.
See you Wednesday. Have a good one.